In the early days of 1942, the tropical paradise of Rabaul, nestled on the northern tip of New Britain, was a place of deceptive calm. To the young men of the Australian Lark Force stationed there, the azure waters and swaying palms seemed a world away from the carnage of the Eastern Front in Europe. However, beneath this tranquility lay a catastrophic strategic failure. For decades, Australia had anchored its entire national security on the Singapore strategy, a firm belief that the British Empire, the mother country, would deploy a massive naval fleet and the latest Spitfire fighters to shield its Pacific colonies from any aggressor. It was a strategy built on colonial faith, and in 1942 that faith was about to be shattered. As the Imperial Japanese tide swept southward, the reality of Australia's isolation became agonizingly clear. Great Britain, locked in a life-or-death struggle with Hitler's Luftwaffe, had no ships or modern aircraft to spare for the Pacific. The impenetrable fortress of Singapore was on the verge of a humiliating collapse, and the promised British umbrella had vanished. Suddenly, Rabaul, the golden gate to the Australian mainland, found itself as a lonely, exposed target. The Australian government, having deferred its defense responsibilities to London for so long, realized too late that they had been left in a strategic blind spot. Tasked with guarding the skies over this vital port was the RAAF's numbered 24 Squadron. The pilots, many of whom were mere boys who had only recently earned their wings, looked at the horizon with a growing sense of dread. They weren't just facing the Japanese, they were facing the consequences of a decade of political complacency. There were no radar arrays, no heavy anti-aircraft batteries, and most importantly, no modern interceptors. While the Japanese were preparing to launch their elite carrier-borne wings, the most sophisticated naval air power in the world, the defenders of Rabaul were left to improvise with the remnants of an abandoned colonial policy. The mood at the Lakanai airfield was one of grim, bush pragmatism. The pilots began to realize that reinforcements from the United States were also a distant dream. Washington had adopted a Germany-first policy, prioritizing the European theater for their latest P-40 Kitty Hawks and P-39 Airacobras. Australia was at the bottom of the global priority list. Rabaul was not just an outpost, it was a sacrificial pawn on a global chessboard. The Barefoot Pilots of number 24 Squadron were about to become the victims of a monumental miscalculation, left to defend a continent with equipment that belonged in a flight school, not a war zone. The stage was set for a tragedy of epic proportions, where the courage of a few would have to answer for the failures of many. As the threat of invasion intensified, the Australian government turned to its domestic hangars, only to find a hollow shell of an air force. The Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, CAC, was a fledgling enterprise, established just years prior in a frantic attempt to give the continent some semblance of industrial independence. However, in early 1942, the corporation was still in its infancy, learning to walk while the world was already sprinting toward total war. The primary fruit of this labor was the CAC Wirraway, a machine that was never intended to be a weapon of war, but a tool of education. The Wirraway was essentially a child of desperation. Based on the North American NA-16, it was a sturdy, reliable trainer designed to teach young cadets how to take off, land, and perform basic maneuvers. It was a school bus of the skies, built for stability and forgiveness, not for the high-G stresses of a dogfight or the blistering speeds of modern interception. Because Great Britain had withheld the legendary Spitfires to defend London, and because American factories were Don Luc, concentrating resources on the Europe First policy, the Wirraway was all Australia could produce. It was a trainer forced onto the front lines, a direct result of being abandoned by the powers Australia had once trusted. The technical specifications of the Wirraway read like a death warrant when compared to the requirements of the Pacific Theater. It was a low-wing monoplane with a radial engine that struggled to push the aircraft past 220 mm. Its armament was a tragic joke. Two 303 caliber machine guns that were more suited for target practice than for piercing the duralumin skins of Japanese bombers. Its skin was thin, its climb rate was sluggish, and it possessed no self-sealing fuel tanks or pilot armor. In the eyes of the veteran Japanese pilots, the Wirraway was not an opponent, it was a target. Yet the Barefoot Pilots of number 24 Squadron had no other choice. They spent their days at Rabaul trying to up-arm these trainers, bolting on improvised bomb racks and checking the synchronization of their meager guns. The ground crews worked miracles with limited tools, knowing that the industrial might of Australia was far too young to provide anything better. Every time a pilot climbed into a Wirraway, he was making a statement of absolute defiance against the political failure that had left him so poorly equipped. The Wirraway was a symbol of an Australia that had been caught unprepared, a country that had relied on the protection of an empire only to find itself standing alone with a handful of training planes. It was a mismatch of tragic proportions, a fledgling industry's first attempt at a plane being sent to face the absolute pinnacle of naval aviation. As the sirens began to wail over Rabaul, the Barefoot Pilots strapped themselves into these tin cans, knowing they were about to fly a training mission into the heart of a massacre. While Australia was scrambling to weaponize its training planes, the Empire of Japan was unveiling a masterpiece of military foresight. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was not merely an aircraft. It was the ultimate manifestation of a nation that had been meticulously preparing for this conflict for decades. Unlike the Australian government, which had deferred its defense to distant allies, the Japanese High Command had invested heavily in domestic innovation, demanding a fighter that could dominate the vast distances of the Pacific. The result was a predator that seemed to belong to a different century than the sluggish Wirraway. The Zero was a terrifying marvel of engineering. It was incredibly fast, exceptionally nimble, and possessed a range that defied Allied logic. Its design stripped away everything non-essential, resulting in a weight-to-power ratio that allowed it to outclimb and outturn any opponent in the sky. To the Barefoot Pilots staring up from the runways of Rabaul, the Zero represented a level of technological perfection they could only dream of. Armed with twin 20mm cannons, the Zero didn't just fire bullets. It delivered explosive shells that could shred a Wirraway's wooden and fabric components in a single pass. The contrast between the two forces was a stark illustration of preparation versus improvisation. On one side, you had the Japanese Naval Air Service, pilots who were the product of a brutal, elite training regime, flying machines designed specifically for the conquest of the Pacific. On the other side stood the Australians, volunteers who had been given the leftovers of an abandoned strategy, flying trainers because their industrial base was too young to offer anything else. The Japanese had spent years perfecting the blitzkrieg of the skies. The Australians were trying to learn how to survive it on the fly. This was a clash between a superpower at its zenith and a young nation in a state of sudden, violent awakening. The Japanese pilots arrived over Rabaul with a supreme, almost arrogant confidence. They knew the Singapore strategy had failed, and they knew the Australians were trapped. To the Zero pilots, the Wirraways were not honorable adversaries but practice targets to be cleared away as Japan consolidated its Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. As the sun caught the glint of the silver Zeros diving from the clouds, the psychological gap was as wide as the technical one. The Australians were fighting for their very existence with improvised tools, while the Japanese were executing a long-held plan with precision instruments. The Barefoot Pilots knew that in a traditional dogfight, the Zero was unbeatable. Every engagement would be a test of how much heart could compensate for a lack of hardware. It was the ultimate predator versus the ultimate underdog, a clash that would force Australia to finally realize that in the modern world, courage without preparation is a recipe for tragedy. On the morning of January 20th, 1942, the sky over Rabaul finally collapsed. As the radarless horizon was breached by over 100 Japanese aircraft, the Barefoot Pilots of No. 24 Squadron were ordered into the air. It was a command born of desperation, a final attempt to justify a failed defense policy. 8 CAC Wirraways, the school buses of the RAAF, banked into the tropical sky to meet a swarm of elite Zeros and heavy bombers. It was not a battle. It was a massacre that laid bare the cost of years of national complacency. As the Australians struggled to climb, the Zeros dived with predatory grace. The technical chasm between the two sides was bridged only by the sheer, crazy bravery of the Australian airmen. Within the first few minutes, the air was thick with the smell of cordite and the sight of burning trainers spiraling into the sea. The Wirraways were so slow that the Japanese pilots had to lower their landing gear or flap their wings just to stay behind them without overshooting. It was a humiliating display of aerial superiority. The 303 machine guns of the Australians sparked harmlessly off the Zero's wings, while the Japanese 20mm cannons tore through the unarmored Wirraways like saws through balsa wood. In just 7 minutes, the air defense of Rabaul was annihilated. 6 of the 8 Wirraways were shot down or destroyed beyond repair. Young men who had signed up to defend their homes were slaughtered in cockpits that offered no protection, victims of a strategy that had assumed me on Mother England would always be there to provide the shield. As the survivors limped back to the pockmarked airfields, the smoke rising from the wreck served as a funeral pyre for the Singapore strategy. This 7-minute slaughter was the brutal price of political failure. It was the moment Australia realized that its reliance on distant empires was a death sentence. The pilots had done their duty, staying in the fight until their planes disintegrated around them, but they had been sent to a knife fight with a spoon. The news of the massacre sent a shockwave through the Australian mainland. It was no longer a matter of distant reports from Europe. The war was here, the enemy was superior, and the country was virtually defenseless. The tragedy at Rabaul forced a violent national reckoning. It was the crushing of the egg that finally woke the Australian people to the reality that they were alone in the Pacific. The Barefoot Pilots had sacrificed themselves to prove a point that should have been obvious. A nation that cannot defend its own skies is a nation at the mercy of its enemies. As the Japanese ground forces prepared to storm the beaches, the survivors of No. 24 Squadron were left with the bitter knowledge that they had been the sacrificial lambs of a failed era. The era of colonial dependence was over. The era of desperate self-reliance had begun. While the disaster at Rabaul had effectively decapitated the RAAF's presence in the region, the spirit of the Barefoot Pilots refused to be buried in the debris. Amidst the overwhelming darkness of the Japanese advance, a singular event occurred that would stun both the Allied and Axis commands. It was the moment Sergeant Pilot John Archer, flying a plane that the Japanese had dismissed as a mere practice target, delivered a resounding slap in the face to Imperial arrogance. It was the ultimate David versus Goliath moment of the Pacific War. On May 14, 1943, Archer was flying his CAC Wirraway on a tactical reconnaissance mission near Gona, New Guinea. By this point in the war, the Wirraway had been largely relegated to safe secondary duties, as its reputation as a death trap in combat was well known. Archer was scanning the jungle canopy for enemy troop movements when he spotted a silver glint below him. It was a Mitsubishi A6M0, the very predator that had slaughtered his comrades at Rabaul. The Japanese pilot was cruising with the supreme confidence of a predator that believed it had no equals in these skies. He was flying low, his situational awareness likely dulled by the repetitive ease of his previous victories. He never expected a slow, clunky Australian trainer to be a threat. Archer, however, saw a fleeting window of opportunity. He knew he couldn't outrun the Zero, and he certainly couldn't outturn it. His only chance was to use the one thing the Wirraway still had, the weight of its own desperation. Archer pushed the control column forward, sending the Wirraway into a screaming dive. The airframe groaned, the rivets straining as the trainer reached speeds it was never designed to sustain. He lined up the Zero in his primitive gun sights. The Japanese pilot, realizing too late that a sheep was diving at him with bared teeth, tried to bank away, but Archer was already committed. He squeezed the trigger, and the twin 303 machine guns, weapons the Nazis and Japanese had mocked as peep shooters, roared to life. A concentrated burst of lead ripped into the Zero's engine and cockpit. The Japanese fighter, built for agility at the expense of armor, lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. In a spectacular burst of flame, the invincible Zero disintegrated and plummeted into the sea. Archer had achieved the impossible. A training plane had killed the world's most elite fighter. When the news reached the mainland, it provided a psychological jolt that Australia desperately needed. Archer was awarded the Silver Star by General Douglas MacArthur, but the true prize was the shattered myth of Japanese invincibility. Archer's victory was a message to the arrogant high command in Tokyo. The rats and barefoot pilots they mocked were capable of biting back. It proved that while Australia had been left behind by its allies, its men possessed a deadly ingenuity that no technical manual could account for. The egg had not just survived, it had finally crushed the rock. The term Barefoot Pilots was far more than a catchy moniker for the history books. It was a gritty, unvarnished description of the Australian reality in the Pacific. By early 1942, the supply lines from Great Britain had been severed, and the promised torrent of American Lend-Lease equipment was nothing more than a trickle directed elsewhere. The airmen of No. 24 Squadron found themselves fighting a high-tech war on a shoestring budget, abandoned by the global powers and left to survive on the scraps of a forgotten front. The physical conditions at the airfields in New Britain and New Guinea were a nightmare of logistical neglect. While Japanese pilots operated from well-supplied bases with ample spare parts and specialized gear, the Australians were living in a state of bush improvisation. The tropical humidity was a constant enemy, rotting flight suits and rusting delicate instruments. Due to the chronic shortage of proper flight boots and uniforms, it was not uncommon to see pilots sprinting to their Wirraways in nothing but tattered khaki shorts and singlets, often completely barefoot or in simple rubber sandals. They weren't fighting for the prestige of a polished empire. They were fighting for the very soil beneath their feet, feeling the grit of the runway between their toes. This barefoot existence extended to the maintenance of their aircraft. The ground crews became the unsung heroes of the Pacific, performing industrial miracles every day. When a Wirraway was riddled with zero cannon fire, there were no factory-fresh replacement panels. Instead, crews would scavenge duralumin from crashed wrecks, stitching the planes back together with whatever rivets and wire they could find. They filtered fuel through shirts to remove sand and used repurposed automotive oils to keep the radial engines turning. The Wirraway, a child of Australia's industrial infancy, was being kept alive by sheer willpower and make-do ingenuity. The mental toll of this shoestring warfare was immense. The pilots were acutely aware that they were the victims of a monumental political miscalculation. They knew they were flying outdated trainers against the world's best fighters because their leaders had failed to plan for a self-reliant defense. Yet this shared hardship gave birth to a unique, defiant brand of mateship. There was no room for rigid military hierarchy in the mud and heat of Rabaul. Officers and mechanics worked side by side, united by the knowledge that no one was coming to save them. They fought with a grim, dark humor, mocking the very Singapore strategy that had left them in this mess. They were the forgotten men of the Pacific, but in their isolation, they found a ferocious independence. They proved that while an empire might abandon its colonies, the people of those colonies would not abandon each other. The Barefoot Pilots became the personification of a nation learning, through sweat, blood, and a lack of boots, that its survival depended not on distant promises, but on its own rugged resilience. The smoke rising from the charred remains of No. 24 Squadron at Rabaul was a signal that could not be ignored. The 7 minutes of horror had stripped away the last vestiges of Australia's colonial delusions. The realization was as bitter as it was clear. Mother England was not coming, and the United States was preoccupied with its own recovery. For the first time in its history, Australia faced the terrifying reality of a sovereign threat with no one to stand beside it. This bitter awakening served as the catalyst for one of the most remarkable industrial feats in the nation's history. The tragedy of the Barefoot Pilots had proven that the Wirraway was a death trap in a dogfight, yet it was also the only blueprint Australia possessed. In a desperate race against time, the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, CAC, was tasked with an impossible mission: design and build a genuine interceptor using the existing Wirraway production line. This was not a project born of luxury or long-term planning. It was a fighter born of necessity. The resulting aircraft, aptly named the CAC Boomerang, was a defiant response to the failures that had led to the massacre at Rabaul. The Boomerang was a testament to Australian bush engineering. By utilizing the wing, tail, and fuselage structure of the Wirraway trainer, engineers saved months of design time. However, they replaced the sluggish engine with a powerful 1,200 horsepower twin Wasp and uparmed the airframe with 20mm cannons and 303 machine guns. It was a Frankenfighter, stout, rugged, and built to withstand the brutal conditions of the Pacific. Just 14 weeks after the design was approved, the first Boomerang took to the skies. It was a miracle of industrial mobilization for a nation that had been told for decades it couldn't survive without British steel. The birth of the boomerang signaled the end of the era of dependence. It was the physical manifestation of Australia's transition from a collection of colonies into a self-reliant nation. While the boomerang would never match the speed of the Zero at high altitudes, it became a legendary jungle fighter, providing close air support for the troops on the ground in New Guinea, the very soldiers whom the Wirraway pilots had died to protect. The lesson of valor from Rabaul had finally been translated into hardware. The sacrifice of those who flew trainers into battle had bought the time necessary for this awakening. The RAAF was no longer a dumping ground for outdated Imperial equipment. It was becoming a modern, independent force. The Barefoot Pilots had shown that the spirit was there. The Boomerang ensured that, moving forward, that spirit would be backed by fire. The era of the sacrificial pawn was over. Australia had finally learned to build its own shield, forged in the fires of a defeat that it vowed never to repeat. The story of the Barefoot Pilots and their clunky Wirraways is more than just a footnote in the history of aerial combat. It is a foundational pillar of the modern Australian identity. While the world remembers the iconic Spitfires and Mustangs, Australia remembers the school bus that stood its ground when everyone else had retreated. The 242-day struggle of the Rats of Tobruk on the ground found its aerial twin in the 7-minute massacre over Rabaul. Both stories share a common thread: the refusal of the Australian spirit to be intimidated by the technical superiority of a global superpower. Today, the legacy of No. 24 Squadron serves as a permanent reminder of the dangers of strategic complacency. The Barefoot Pilots did not just fight a war, they exposed a fatal flaw in a nation that had outsourced its soul to a distant empire. Their sacrifice was the painful price Australia paid to learn the most important lesson of statehood: that a country's freedom is only as secure as its ability to defend itself. The memory of those burning trainers over New Britain eventually paved the way for the self-reliant, high-tech Royal Australian Air Force we see today, a force that never again wants to send its sons to a knife fight with a spoon. Furthermore, the Barefoot legend has become a symbol of the Aussie underdog. In a world that often prizes the biggest, the fastest, and the most expensive, the story of John Archer and his miraculous kill proves that character, timing, and raw courage are the ultimate equalizers. Archer's Wirraway, now resting in the Australian War Memorial, is not a monument to a perfect machine, but a monument to a perfect moment of defiance. It tells every visitor that no matter how lopsided the odds, there is always a chance for the egg to crush the rock if the hand on the stick is steady enough. The Barefoot Pilots also redefined the concept of mateship in the sky. They flew into certain death not for an empire that had abandoned them, but for the infantrymen in the trenches below, who were their brothers, cousins, and friends. This jungle-level bond, born in the mud, heat, and barefoot scrambles of Rabaul, became the gold standard for the RAAF. It is a legacy of grit over glamour, proving that a pilot's true worth is measured by his willingness to stay in the fight when the safe option is to dive for home. As the years pass and the roar of the radial engines fades into history, the Barefoot Pilots remain a beacon of resilience. They remind us that when you are Don Vao Zhuang Kung, pushed into a corner, and left with nothing but a repurposed trainer and your own courage, you don't surrender, you climb. Their story is an eternal tribute to the underdog spirit, the belief that a light that refuses to go out can never be truly defeated. Australia may have started the war as a sacrificial pawn, but thanks to the men of the Wirraway, it ended as a nation that knew exactly what it was worth. The story of the Barefoot Pilots is a reminder that courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to fly despite it. If you believe these untold stories of heroism deserve to be remembered, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Help us keep the legacy of the underdogs alive. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next forgotten chapter of history.